Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome. My name is Claire Line-Weber. I'm the Executive Director of the Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, which we call Sci-City here at Yale. Sci-City is a hub for student innovation at the university, so all students, grad and undergrad. And this panel today will be talking about creating the space for innovation in the arts. And we mean space very broadly, so physical space, virtual space, kind of mental, emotional, whatever, space for thinking and doing. So all those different interpretations of creating space. And including space to fail, space to feel welcome, and then space to thrive. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. I'm going to keep the introductions pretty short since the event app has very detailed bios that you can check out. So I will start to my immediate left, David Sterling Brown, who's Associate Professor of English at Trinity College here in Connecticut. Christine Kwan, who's the President and Executive Director of Creative Capital. Kristen Marting, who's the founding artistic director of the Here Art Center and also co-founder and co-director of the Prototype Festival, which you've heard several people mention in other arts tracks. And Jennifer Harrison Newman, who's associate artistic director at the Yale Schwartzman Center. And so to kick things off, I thought we would start with a very broad but direct question about what is at the heart of what we do? Why are we doing what we're doing, and how are we doing it? To give a brief introduction to our different organizations and how they are active in this space of creating space for innovation in the arts. So I'm going to start at the far end and work back towards me. Jennifer, would you mind kicking that off?
Okay, how's that? Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. So the Schwartzman Center is probably just, in terms of a concept and an idea, it's probably closer to about 10 years old, but in function and actually activating space, we're really just entering our third year. And, we came to be really from the idea of how to create a sense of belonging and cohesion on a campus that has multiple silos on that. And there was a sort of overwhelming desire for people across disciplines to connect. And what's really exciting about using the arts to do that is there's a way to activate across form, but also to highlight how the arts sort of do uplift all the work that's being done on campus that's not necessarily arts focused. It could be obviously in research, it could be in sciences and medicine, it can be in health, but that there are these intersections that were sort of invisible, and that by having a center dedicated to the arts at the center of wellness, belonging, collaboration, those invisible connections and were made visible.
Hi, so I'm a director and a creative producer, and I founded the organization that I've run for the last 30 years with a group of other artists. And at the core of what we do is support multidisciplinary artists to make work on their terms. So instead of saying how they need to make what they're making, we talk to each artist and we craft a process that's built around how they want to make their work. And we do long-term commission development and support of artists. So we're not just with them one stop of the way. We try to be with them through the whole arc of the work and to craft a process that uses our experience as an organization with their passion and unique vision as an artist to put that arc together really organically in each case.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Kwan from Creative Capital. We're a nonprofit organization that funds individual artists across the country. Our primary purpose is to uplift underinvested experimental artists. And we were founded in 1999 after the National Endowment for the Arts discontinued its grants to individual artists because of some of the controversial work that was being created with the NEA funds. And so part of the reason we exist is really to fund innovation in the arts. And we do so through a democratic open call. So the artist does not have to have a connection to any institution or any part of the establishment to be eligible to apply. So that's what we do.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Sterling Brown. I'm Associate Professor of English at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And first and foremost, I am an educator. I'm a Shakespeare scholar, so Shakespeare and critical race studies. I'm an author, writer, and editor. And at the heart of what I do is public engagement and activism, primarily through my speaking and writing, with an emphasis on social justice. And so I use Shakespeare as a vehicle to help people enter into other conversations such as mental health, feminism, violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, addiction, family dynamics, and allowing people to see that through Shakespeare's art, we can see the issues of today in the past and reflect on them. I'm also a curatorial team member for Claudia Rankin's The Racial Imaginary Institute, and I'm the creator of the David Sterling Brown Gallery, which is a virtual reality art gallery that complements my Cambridge University press book, Shakespeare's White Others.
Thank you. I want to say a little bit about the Sci Center as well. So we, similar to the Schwarzman Center in some ways, are a center at Yale that's intended specifically for students across all disciplines. So I will use our mission statement to illustrate this. It's to inspire students from diverse backgrounds and disciplines to seek innovative ways to solve real-world problems. So by design, very broad mission, focused on students' special projects and initiatives they'd like to get going, but also the curious and the exploring, very much about creating a welcoming, hospitable place for all Yale students to come to learn and experiment and build. So very, I think, very innovative in the way the center was designed at Yale, not part of a school. We're not part of a specific school. We report into the provost's office. We also are trying to break down some silos at the university. I think having some early success, but always trying to think about how to move that forward more aggressively. So I thought I would start with a question because in a lot of the discussions we've been hearing in the arts track, there's been a lot of talk about systems change. Yes, we're trying to create support models for support in artistic communities and artistic innovation, but also change the very kind of rules by which people access resources and see their work flourish and thrive. And so I know one of the questions we talked about as we were preparing for this panel discussion was selection processes. What do those look like? You know, sometimes it can feel kind of mysterious, application-based processes for accessing resources. So what do those processes look like? How does technology factor into that? And then how does it provide leverage for the kind of systems change we're seeking to make? So I will start with Christine, actually. So you were talking about the processes you use, how you've developed them, and then the importance of data for running your own operations, but then also engaging in dialogue with potential funders and raising additional capital. If you would talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So when I joined Creative Capital, one of the things I was really looking at was equity and generosity. And I was looking at how accessible our grant application was. And as many of you know, if you've applied for grants, a lot of these grants are very, very difficult for an individual to complete. They take weeks and weeks. You have to have letters of recommendation, which basically means you have to come from within the system. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get competitive letters of recommendation. And so we were looking at this. We were also looking at the fact that we had not been funding that many Indigenous artists. We have been funding a lot of artists of color. More than 75% of our grantees in recent years were artists of color. But I was just looking at that. And what we decided to do, which was quite radical for us, was to overhaul the entire grant application and narrow it down from 40 questions with letters of recommendation down to 6 short questions with no work samples, no project budget, no CVs or anything like nothing that you would have to create for us in round 1. And that was a breath of fresh air for a lot of artists and a huge relief because a lot of artists did not have the time to even throw their hat in the ring. So that was number 1. The second thing we did with awardee services was we used to do everything by phone or by email, but you had to really get in touch with a human being at Creative Capital. So if you got a Creative Capital award and you wanted to access our array of services, and we give every awardee whatever they need in terms of professional development. So if they need a lawyer, an attorney, a fabricator, a librettist, whatever they need, we source that, we pay for that. And that was something that was very labor intensive for the artist as well, because they would have to have these scheduled calls with our staff to figure that out. And we used technology to create a buffet of services where the artist could request these services on demand and make them basically bespoke to exactly what the artist needs. The third piece that is very new, I welcome everyone to check this out. We have always been doing professional development in person as workshops, and we used to charge artists a small fee of like $35, and some artists couldn't afford it. We would give them a discount, it'd be $12, and you all can do the math. We did not make any money from these workshops, and we also always had to fundraise, and we always had to write grants anyway. So last year we launched our first free online Creative Capital curriculum. You can just go to our website. It's on the education page. It's free. It's everything that you need to know to apply for any grant. So how to write an artist statement, how to put together your CV, how to put together your project budget, how to think about your social media. And we have had 15,000 artists register from 91 countries in the last 6 months. So there's clearly a need to use technology to deliver these services to artists. So those are a few examples.
Those are excellent. I was hoping, Kristen, you would comment as well. Yes.
Yeah, so our residency program, we have every year we take 2 or 3 artists, and it's $125,000 commitment, $50,000 in cash, and $75,000 in space equipment and services. So we really wanted to be sure that any artist that was interested would have the ability to apply and to access, feel that there was an open access. So a number of years ago, we changed to a panel process. So there wasn't the gatekeeping of me as the artistic leader or the other associate artistic directors. So we had a panel process, but then we felt like that was still like, how did those people get selected for the panel? So there was still an issue. So we changed the system several years ago to being that people who apply could recommend 3 people to be panelists. And then we would collect all the people that anyone who applied recommended and ask if they were willing to serve as a panelist. And when we got the yeses and their availability, then we would go back to the applicants and say, these are the people who are available. Please select your top 3 choices. And so we assembled our panel truly from the applicant pool to try to create a space where people really felt their work could be heard and seen by their peers or by colleagues who they respected. And that's really expanded the applicant pool and expanded the panelists that are looking at the work. Our program usually we're a multidisciplinary program, and we define it as artists who aren't at the beginning of their career, but artists who have already received some funding, that have made a full-length body of work, and they're ready to take their work to a next stage, and they can really benefit from a peer group. So our program also, once you're selected for the program, you're part of a group of other artists that are battling their individual dragons with their projects, but you have a peer group that you can sounding board off of. So I think those things are really been key components.
I like that idea of not exactly crowdsourcing the panelists, but taking that proactive approach to have them provided by the community as opposed to asserting who they are. And does anyone else want to say anything about? I was going to move on, but does anyone else want to say anything about use of technology specifically to manage, like bringing in and selecting projects? Okay. One thing I wanted to ask you, David, was about the work that you did. So first of all, the virtual, if you could talk about the work you did that you put online during the pandemic and the inception of that project and how that created a space both for you and for your students to access the work.
Sure. So I worked with a digital specialist from UCLA to create this virtual reality art gallery that's accessible through my website, which is a public resource funded by the National Endowment for Humanities and the Mellon Foundation. and an ACLS. And what it is, it's 39 images of art that are pulled from the Folger Shakespeare Library's digital art collection. And it's all accessible, so you don't need virtual reality goggles to access it, but it makes the experience more immersive and fun. And I created this because when the pandemic started, there was a lot of limited access to things like theater or even being able to go to places like art galleries. And I'm very much in the business as an academic of solving problems, or at least thinking about solutions to problems. And this art gallery space is a complement to my book. And so a way for people to get into Shakespeare who may fear Shakespeare. There's a lot of that in the world. There might be some people in this room who fear Shakespeare. You don't need to. And using that, though, as a public resource, so that, and a free resource, so that people can access conversations that are also really important to today, as I said in the introduction. And I also use this space as a sort of virtual classroom. So thinking back to the pandemic when we weren't able to have face-to-face meetings in campus settings, I use this space still, even though we're now back in the classroom, to meet with my students. And it's sort of creates, I want to say, an easier way for them to have difficult conversations because we're all in this space together. They're using avatars, but so I hear their voices. So I know who's in the room, but there's a way that some of the pressure is taken off when we're having difficult conversations about racism or sexual violence and things of that nature, and it makes them more comfortable. So that resource was built on the Mozilla Hubs platform, which is actually having a sunset tomorrow. So, so if you want to check out the site, just go to my website, davidsterlingbrown.com, and you can check that out. But technology is a great vehicle for allowing us to be together even when we're not, because this gallery is accessible anywhere in the world as long as someone has a strong Wi-Fi connection.
Does this mean the the virtual reality art gallery is gone as of tomorrow, or?
So it will go away. It'll come back, and I'll put it back on my site. Yeah, I have to move it, migrate it. So that's one of the things with technology. Things change when new CEOs come into place. So.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I want to move on to something that's popped up again and again in the conversations also about the arts, which is actually, so if those of you were in the last panel discussion in this room, Jean-Luc Bontemps said, I learned everything. Something about having a great arts education at Yale, but nothing on the business side, that he had to figure that out later on his own through just engaging with the world and asking good questions. So I wanted to ask this group, and maybe I'll start, take a drink of water, but I'll start with you, David, because you said something in response when I said, is entrepreneurship a bad word? Is it a word that that doesn't resonate sufficiently with artists? And then related to that, this is probably a deeper question, but actually for all of us working, because in some ways we're all educators in addition to running the organizations we do. Should there be a place in arts education for entrepreneurship, skill building?
I think so. You know, when I look at, but I'm not an artist per se. I mean, I do write, but one of the things that I learned through the process of building the virtual reality art gallery as somebody who has an English degree, an English PhD, is that there are skills that are very useful that I learned through Claudia Rankine's Racial Imaginary Institute, actually, when I think about what does it mean to curate an art gallery, for instance, or even build one. You know, what would it mean to have a brick and mortar one, for instance, and what skills would be needed by me, you know, a humanist scholar, to be able to do that. There are deficits because of my education being so rooted in just Shakespeare studies, right? But if things were more cross-disciplinary, I think that would be helpful. And these are also skills that I would want to transfer to my students. So before going to graduate school, I actually worked as a recruiter for Teach for America for 3 years. And so those skills that I had as a recruiter, marketing, data analysis, et cetera, play into how I operate as a scholar. But I only have that background because of that job.
Yeah, I was going to say, Jennifer, so you've got a deep background as an artist, but you're also now running an organization here at Yale. You're working with students, but also other creatives. So yeah, what is your perspective on this question?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I understand why in a when a student chooses to come to a school to study specifically their instrument, whether it be their body, their acting, their musical instrument, that there's this finite amount of time, and the pedagogy is to really get them in to be that brilliant artist. But I do find that it is doing a disservice to, I think, a student to send them out into the world that if they can't read a contract. It leaves them sort of at the behest of others to do that for them, and I just think that doesn't set them up for success in the world. In the future, it just takes away some independence, I think, for them, and disempowers them. Similarly, just understanding, and I think also, I'll say this, that I think a lot of successful artists also are entrepreneurs, they just don't use the same words, right? And they haven't put words to it that are actually the same thing, or maybe not have broken it down into the formal blocks that we might call them. So for example, I mean, a visual artist who has a gallerist who is in the market is fully engaged with the market, and knows who they have to talk to, and knows, they know exactly how to produce their work in time and to keep that cycle going. So they're very much in a system, and they just might not call it that. So I think maybe just being a little more explicit, or just finding language that folks feel a little more comfortable with. And same with actors. I mean, they're in the business, especially ones who are in the market. They're in the business, and they know how to have a meeting. They know how to pitch themselves. They know how to pitch the work. They know how to cast. And then it's just a matter of, I think, calling it what it is, maybe.
So I was going to ask a little bit more about the language then. So calling it what it is, are there, not to put you on the spot, but are there words that are at the top of your mind right now? And like what would be the right language to use?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have those words necessarily, but if we were, I did not get an MBA, so there's going to be a lot of words that I'm not familiar with. But what does it mean to? I guess let's just simplify it, like a business plan. No, like what does that mean? And there is conversation around the difference between a product and getting it, going through various steps of fundraising and getting it into the world and scaling. But similarly, how do you map that to a career in the arts? And I think it would be very useful for students to sort of have that kind of map, or have those conversations at least before they get sent out into the world, to sort of understand what their steps are. And I do believe a lot of students are doing that. And there are artists that are very good at it. I don't think that it detracts from their work. It's not making their work is not suffering from being very clear about it. And there's certain spectrums. There are folks that are working in a very avant-garde manner, and there's some that are working much more commercially. But you can have successful careers across the spectrum, and having that plan and that map, I think, is very useful.
Yeah, thank you for that. I actually agree. I think the more I think about what's being signaled, so I won't claim this was my original thought. This came up in the fireside chat with Chelsea Clinton yesterday, where she was talking about med school and medical students having only brief introductions to certain topics in women's health, and that had a signaling effect to the students that this isn't very important, or maybe there's not much money to be made at it, or you don't really need to know this. And I thought immediately about artists, students specifically, and what are arts schools or programs signaling when they're not giving any attention to this as part of the curriculum or the degree program. It doesn't have to be a huge part, but if it's not integrated at all, what is that telling the student? So I wanted to come back to another topic that's come up a lot, which is artists' agency, ownership over their own IP, kind of taking the language from innovation and entrepreneurship, specifically technology, but there's IP there. So I'll start with Kristen. So you're working with artists who are, maybe some of them are students, but probably they're beyond the student phase of their careers. What do you provide for them educationally to address some of these issues of maintaining control over their work, the agency, the intellectual property that they've developed?
Yeah. So we offer the option for breakout sessions that they choose. So we don't say, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. They almost always choose some of the same, but there are always different ones. But intellectual property and collaboration agreements is something that all of them want because it's always a complicated issue. And we have a really wonderful lawyer who we work with pro bono who specializes in that area. So he comes and does a session with them for about 2 to 3 hours. And he has like a wrap that he does that's like a half hour, 45 minutes, but then the rest of the session is him really taking concrete questions from them and then hearing the questions about, okay, there are 2 of us that started this project and now there's a 3rd one coming on board. How do we decide in a fair way how our decision-making process is going to work? How do we decide if we are in an agreement? How do we, these are very thorny issues. And in the arts, there's a tendency, because I think of the training practice, not to raise these issues and talk about them in an open way, and that artists feel like it's taking away from the creative process to try to address these issues. But then when you get deeper into the process, it becomes even more awkward if you haven't raised these and actually vetted them in an open way. So it's trying to normalize for the group that we're collaborating with, like, let's have these conversations in a really open way. Let's really articulate what's important to us and move that forward. So I think that I also was someone who went to art school and had no background in business, started a theater company. And I always say the most important thing I've learned is I did it wrong once, I'm not going to do it wrong that way again. That's the most important lesson in running an arts organization. But I think I've learned in the trenches, and I think a lot of arts makers learn in the trenches. And I actually think we're very adaptable because of our collaborative process and the number of inputs that we are constantly navigating in a creative process. And I think it makes us very well suited to a number of different business environments and a number of different creative environments. And that there's a way that we undersell that capability and that flexibility that we have. A lot of industries don't have the flexibility that we bring. So I think that's a strength of ours.
That's a very good point. And Christine, you mentioned the bespoke educational or workshops that you...
Yeah, the professional development also. I agree with everything everyone said, and also the earlier panel addressed some of these issues as well, if you were here for that. So Creative Capital also believes that artists need more than just funding. They need that scaffolding around their professional practice to really build sustainable careers. And one of the things that I've learned in this role is that artists are at various different levels of entrepreneurship and business savvy. Some artists really want market success. They really want to be in Hollywood. They really want to be at the Cannes Film Festival. Some artists don't want that. That's not their goal. And so what we're trying to do with financial services, with IP, with licensing, with all those opportunities, is we try to find from the artists, what do they want to achieve? And what are the services we can provide to help them achieve their goals? And we no longer assume that everybody wants commercial success or everybody wants to be, a scholar and, a poet and an isolated or whatever. But actually some artists don't want commercial success. So it really has to be bespoke. And then I studied poetry. So I have an MFA in creative writing poetry. And so I can also say, like, there was no business training, but you learn so much because even in the arts, I worked at the Metropolitan Museum, I worked at Artsy, I worked at the Mellon Foundation in various places. And at every point, you have to, in the arts, interact with legal and finance and all of these other aspects of being in the arts. So it's really changing what's possible, I think, with technology around what artists can do. I will also say a lot of artists are extremely savvy, and they're much savvier than us in terms of what we can provide. Like Creative Capital isn't providing the level of services that they need for their wealth management. So there is that level as well.
So, thank you for reminding us all that it's not a monolith, right? There's so many different examples of how you can pursue a career in the arts, and there's not just one map or pathway. I think that's really important to remember. The same for a lot of disciplines. Business itself, it can be at all different scales, from local to global. So, very good reminder. I do want to come back to funding. I think one of the questions I asked as we were talking about this discussion was, things that keep you up at night or pain points in the industry. And that got raised in various ways. The tensions between the healthy pace of artistic innovation and kind of the impatience that's embedded in our culture for quick returns and return on investment, et cetera, as well as the complications of managing donors' expectations, et cetera. Maybe I'll start with Christine here. You mentioned kind of that balancing act and those tensions, and just kind of what the funding environment is like right now. If you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Creative Capital was founded in 1999 by the Andy Warhol Foundation, and we're a separate 501c3 charity. What's unique about us as a grant maker is we fundraise all of the money and then we give it away. So we don't have an endowment. So it's very challenging, I would say, in this environment, especially post-pandemic, when you don't know where your funding is coming from year to year because we don't have an endowment. That being said, what I'm seeing in the ecosystem is there's a lot of interest in supporting artists directly. There's a lot of interest in supporting experimentation. There's a lot of interest in art that is socially engaged. We fund artists like Jeffrey Gibson, who is representing the US at the Venice Biennial this year. We funded Simone Lee. Jeffrey Gibson, we funded 20 years ago. Simone Lee, we funded 10 years ago in 2012. So there's a track record that funding artists at catalytic moments in their careers can have a transformative effect for their local communities, for their region, and for the arts ecosystem at large. And so I think there's a lot of interest in philanthropy in supporting artists and seeing also that there's a huge economic payoff because we know, communities that have a thriving arts center and arts programming do extremely well economically as well. So we're seeing that, but yeah, it's still it's a very challenging landscape.
Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in on that because when I think about early stages of their career, we're talking like 18, 19-year-olds here, a lot of them. So some of the students that we're working with specifically, are at that beginning stage of experimenting and learning, and they're having their minds expanded. And I think for the Schwarzman Center, we're very excited to be able to engage with students at that moment in time to sort of show them options and to give the permission to fail, which I think is really hard in a place like Yale, right? How to not know and not come up with something perfect, but just to try and experiment. And it's very exciting to be a space incubator location. It's kind of, I think of it as we're a reprieve from some of the measurements that exist in a space like Yale, that we can be a space of reprieve in that and experimentation. But I hear so much about like this early support of individual artists and directly in space and time and money. And while the Schwarzman Center certainly works with students and is there for students, we also are a part of the arts economy, greater, like here in New Haven, but also in the world. And how can we serve artists and their collaborators and other partner institutions in this ecosystem together, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with collaboration, a lot of it has to do with conversation and meeting each other and, getting to say yes to some things, and how do we come to a yes? How do we get to say yes to something and try things that may not have been done before? And I think that feels new to me in the field a little bit, is that the collaboration across organizations is really exciting. And how can we support this organization, therefore supporting this artist, therefore supporting this community, and just being a part of and seeing it as a whole ecosystem rather than, fiefdoms.
Yeah, so the breaking down of the silos. Yeah, Kristen.
I'd love to add on to that. I mean, I feel like we are in a time where if we don't collaborate, the work's not going to happen, because the cost of making work is so much higher than it was before the pandemic and continues to grow. And so projects that might have been $100,000 or $120,000 are now more like $300,000 or $400,000 today. And that's appropriate and good in the ways that artists are being compensated more fairly for their work across our industry finally. But that also, and we're also facing higher costs for wood, for paint, for all those things, like 300% higher from where we were before. So a work that in the past would have been manageable for my organization is no longer manageable for my organization to support an artist's full vision. And so if I don't choose to collaborate and be part of an ecosystem, I'm not going to be able to serve my artists well. Their vision is not going to be fulfilled, and the work is not going to live in as broad a place as it deserves to and should. So I think we're really in a time where those collaborations, whether they're between universities and nonprofits and for-profit entities and development centers and foundations and corporations and individuals in government, like it's really like who are all of the people that we can bring to the table to bring this work to fruition, because that's what it's going to take for us to keep thriving and growing and serving the visions that our audiences deserve to experience. Yeah.
Can I ask you? No, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to add on to that. I love this phrase "space to fail" that's been mentioned a couple times because I think that's really important. Like good ideas and strong ideas take time to develop, and sometimes the work may seem to funders and donors to be slow. So one example, for instance, it took me about 5.5 years to write my book. And it took me 2 years to conceptualize and bring to fruition the art gallery. That's a long time, but I got $106,000 from ACLS and the Mellon Foundation to do that work. Not so much on the scale of like a, MacArthur grant, but still no strings really in terms of what I was able to do. And that freedom to create was incredibly helpful because I didn't feel limited by these expectations that the donors had on me. The other thing that I would say too is that because good ideas take time to develop, that's kind of at odds with how our world works in terms of the fast-paced nature of everything, and whether that's marketing or cultural practices or fundraising. And so I really think we need to keep in mind the goals of the work, which can be essential, especially when people are doing social justice-oriented work, for instance.
No, that's a really good point. So I actually, that was a question I wanted to ask you about your students and also creating that space to take a breath and to experiment and to be okay with whatever happens. Also kind of welcoming everyone into the room. Like innovation happens when you have a variety of perspectives, points of view, backgrounds, like that's really exciting to be around. So whether it's that or coming back to this collaboration and partnerships, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more. I know the time is going fast, but maybe just maybe briefly, like when you are thinking about cultivating partnerships or collaborations with others, how are you balancing out who's bringing what to the table? How are you identifying those really excellent collaborators? Weeding out maybe others that might not be so productive. Start with Kristen.
I think sometimes it comes from the artist, that it's a previous developmental space that they've had a relationship with, or another theater that has produced their work. Sometimes it comes from a past collaboration that we've had at here. But it's really like thinking through the developmental timeline for the work and identifying what's the need at this time, what's the resource need and what's the cash need, and then this next stage, what is it? And then thinking, okay, who's the right partner for this step on the journey? And who's the right partner here? And we try really hard never to be territorial. We want as many people to come play and be part of this, supporting this work as possible. And that makes it a much easier way for everyone to come in. Crediting is easy. Give credit to everyone who's been part of the process. Don't be territorial over that. Share. We're all here together to make this work come to life. So I think that it's really like, this is the need, and this person is really fantastic at this need, but we're all not good at the same things, but the show needs all those things. So we can find a way to all work together on it.
Yeah, thank you. And David, when you think about your students, so you're a professor, you're teaching in the classroom. You talked about the virtual space that you created for students to interact with each other safely and that you noticed that they felt more comfortable. Are there other things you've done to encourage their exploration and experimentation and kind of given them permission to be curious and comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot, and I think geez, that's a big question. I give my students so much latitude, and within the confines of whatever I structure for them in the syllabus. But I think it's really important because oftentimes not everybody who comes into my classroom is interested in Shakespeare, right? But they have other interests, whether that's business or could be, they want to go to law school or whatever. But there is so much within Shakespeare, who himself was incredibly creative, that allows my students to see themselves both in the work, but also even in me sometimes, which I think is very useful. But even with the assignments that I give them, I'm thinking about an assignment that I have where I have them drop into a play and just kind of figure out, for instance, what's going on with race in it. It's called a scene isolation exercise. And we do that in a play like Hamlet, for instance. So I'm challenging them intellectually, because most people don't think about Hamlet as a play that is engaging race, but it absolutely is, as all Shakespeare's plays are. And that's another way for them to both feel some pressure to sort of push themselves outside of their comfort zones, but in doing that, it attaches, I think, emotional memories, if you will, because they have this fear of like, can I do it? But once they overcome that, they get really excited about the work. And that's how I got into Shakespeare myself, so.
I love that. That's an amazing example. I do want to leave time for Q&A, but so I'm going to finish with, I'm going to have to figure out which of my last questions I should ask. Maybe a recent project or initiative that your organization, that you're very proud of. And I would encourage everybody to look at the bios and look at the websites, because this patient approach to creativity, it's very clear when you look at the accolades that the organizations have accrued over time through the artists they've supported. It just takes time to see those. So very impressive. But so just a project, an initiative of your choice that you feel really well represents your work, or you're very just very proud of. Starting with Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm gonna actually name two, and it's really because I think speaking to this about time, slowness, and I'm going to put the word trust. I think it's trust and transparency. I think that helps. Transparency helps build the trust. Time makes sure that you're sort of you're actually building. The roots are growing, so that there's some stability rather than with speed. Sometimes things go and it becomes transactional. And I think when you're an organization that's trying to build trust, you don't want to just be in the transaction mode. You want to actually be building a community. So to that end, I would say two projects. The first, very early in our development, was working with Toshi Regan, who is an artist dedicated to a social justice practice. And we did her Parable of the Sower, and we did that in New Haven and built collaboration and community with multiple organizations in the city. And what it allowed us to do is actually just get to know people and to give everyone equal access to the artist. To build trust, we had to go slow, and we had to take the time, and we had to go at the speed of trust. And I think that was a great way to start in the community as a new organization. And then most recently, it's a photo project called A View from Here, which is a collaboration with multiple partners on campus, but is working directly with New Haven high school students in creating photography of their own from their own sort of their daily lives. And so in each version of those, it's rooted in community. It starts with community collaborations, and then the sharing out of the work is shared across collaborators. So I think those are the two for me.
So we have a project coming up in the fall called A Meal, and it's developed by an ensemble called La May. They're a dance theater visual art performance group with a social justice practice, and this piece is dealing with food justice and environmental issues. And so we've been making the piece actually for over 5 years. Because of the pandemic, it's had a longer development trajectory, but we have worked with farmers, we've worked with food co-ops, we've worked with protest groups around the use of land. We've worked with Native artists, and they're a group that is from all different countries, the ensemble themselves. So they're bringing in a lot of different land perspectives in the way that they approach the work. So it's been an incredibly complex work to get our hands around. They're also a Creative Capital funded group. LeMay is the group, not this particular show, but they're a wonderful group. And it's been a process of listening and learning to evolve the aesthetic work that will complete at the end, but we've looked at all the steps of the way as this is the work. It's not that we're making a work for later, it's that each step with this group of farmers is the work. And then this next book binding, cookbook binding of people's personal family recipes from their culture is the work. So the work is all of these things. It's not just some result at the end. And that's been a really beautiful process to be part of.
Thank you. I think the biggest investment we're making at Creative Capital is bringing artists together. We have a long history of community building. And the results of community building, bringing the awardees together, each cohort in person each year, is really transformative. And I'm just thinking back to Titus Kafar, who built Next Haven. His first grant was from Creative Capital back in 2015. And because we brought Titus, and I wasn't at Creative Capital at the time, but that network of bringing artists together to talk to each other across different disciplines, to bring curators, cultural producers, philanthropists, and investors all together as we're doing here today is truly transformative. And I think what we're doing now with the projects that we're funding is we're trying to bring artists together who are working across different disciplines. So one of the artists' projects that we're funding this year, we fund 50 projects each year with $50,000 each, so $2.5 million. So I won't talk about everyone, they're all fabulous. But there is one artist that I think makes sense for today. Her name is Erica Lord. She is an Alaskan Native artist with disabilities who is researching diseases and looking at the DNA of diseases that affect indigenous communities. And she's using traditional beading techniques to create these burden belts out of the DNA patterns and colors. And so just thinking about biotech and science and climate and everything that's happening here today, that's one of the very exciting projects we're supporting.
Right. And for me, I like what Kristen just said about the work is all of those things, because two things I'll mention, I guess. One, my book, Shakespeare's White Other. So that is a scholarly monograph, though, that is also part memoir, too. So I'm kind of breaking down in that book just what people traditionally think of when they're looking at an academic book. And the reason I mention that is because it's very much connected to my website, which is the other project I would say, and that's an ongoing project that I just keep adding to. And since I was listening into the last session and heard somebody mention Beyonce, so I'm going to go ahead and do that too. I'm very much inspired by visuals, and I got inspired, especially when I went to one of her concerts one time. And so my website is very visual, but it's also, I make use of audio, because one of the barriers for people when we think about academics and public intellectuals and engagement is the fact that if you want to read an article, for instance, that I've written, or any academic, sometimes they're not accessible in terms of the language that's used, but oftentimes there are paywalls. And so one of the things that I did on my site is I've recorded some of my articles and read them. So there's an audio section. But when we talk about this idea of the work as being all of those things, I actually ended up being able to narrate and record an audio book version of my book, which I didn't know was going to happen. So when you get time to experiment and explore, it really can just open up so much in the future, but you don't know what's there if you shut it down today.
That's a wonderful place to end. We're going to start the Q&A, so I'm going to be handing off my mic to someone who's going to walk it around. But before we start, do we want to start with the panel? Any of you have a question for another panelist, and then we'll turn it over to the audience? Not to put you on the spot, but if you do have one that you'd like to ask in this context, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the talk. Andrea Ramirez. Going back to your point around the intention and what it is that the artist wants, maybe it's not commercialization. To what extent do you address the awareness. Maybe the artist doesn't realize that they could actually be commercially successful because they haven't seen an artist like themselves in the field. So curious to get your thoughts around that.
That's a really great question. So I think one of the things we try to do with all of our awardees is there's a one-on-one staff meeting, and we walk through all of the services that we provide. So there's a giant menu of services. And part of that is just making the artist aware that even if you never wanted to talk to a wealth manager, we have that service available. So what's also interesting about Creative Capital is this is not 1 year. So they don't just get a check in the mail when they get a Creative Capital grant, and they don't just get 1 year to draw down these services. It's lifelong. So we have artists who will call us they got the grant in 2000, and they will call and say, I remember you guys have legal services, and I have a public art project that was not installed correctly in the city of Seattle, and I need a lawyer to help me fight this. And we will source a public art expert in law in the Pacific Northwest to help that artist. And that's something that happened like the first quarter that I was there. So it's really a kind of safety net that we're trying to provide for artists, where it's like, maybe you don't have $1 million the year that you get Creative Capital, but many of our artists go on and get other grants from Mellon, from Ford Foundation, and suddenly they are getting $2-3 million. And suddenly they do need to have a tax strategy. Suddenly they do need different types of services, real estate services. They call us because they need to know that it's a trusted partner to them. So I think that's really just the awareness is, here's all the services that we can provide to you. You can call us when you need them. And I think that has made all the artists feel good in the sense that they don't have a time pressure to tap into those services right away. And it also goes for industry connections, which is something I didn't mention. So sometimes people want a PR strategist. Sometimes they want a cultural producer, a curator, but they may not be ready the first year that they get the grant to have that conversation. Maybe the book is coming out in 5 years. That's when they want a marketing strategy. So that's the way that we provide those services.
Hi, just want to thank you, panel, for this fantastic discussion. I'm somebody who has operated on the intersection of art and science as an artist myself, but also as an MD, PhD scientist. And one thing that I'm struck by is what's shifting is that the new narrative of health, longevity and regenerative medicine. One thing I'm really concerned about is the need in this new paradigm of health to create stronger bridges and connect the dots between imagination, creativity, and the sciences, and have that really embedded in the DNA of the next paradigm. So I would like to know if you can speak to those sorts of projects. You touched on them, the DNA one, which is fantastic. That is speaking to the fact that we are all sourced from, we can track this from our mitochondrial DNA maternally, from all modern man, sourced from one human being who lived in Africa 180,000 years ago. There is an incredible diversity that's present, but a deep connectivity that is singular across a human being. So just wonder if you can kind of spitball and randomly speak to funding opportunities and collaborative opportunities for this new shift in health and wellness.
I think there's a whole session on that coming up. Someone from this panel, someone from the summit can pitch it, because I know it's on pharmacy writing, like prescription writing for the arts. But I think there is, like, the Sloan Foundation does fund science-driven projects in an arts context. I was the recipient of one of those grants for a project that I've done called Looking at You with Kamala Shankaram and Rob Handel. And that project is a piece that's a privacy opera. And what it's talking about is the erosion of our privacy online. And we collaborated with the Carnegie Mellon Privacy Institute to develop the protocols that we use in the show. And we use the tactics that are much, whatever people have made open, we data mine and we serve their data to them in the show, localized to where they're sitting in the theater. And then we also put it up on the big screen. And this is if they've made their data public. And then we have privacy conversations at the end of the opera, and we send a privacy kit to them for them to protect themselves, and we let them know that we've deleted their data now. But the point that we're trying to make is about the behaviors that we engage in unconsciously that are giving up our identity. And with the Carnegie Mellon Institute, they're doing research on the audience behavior and how it changes following the experience of the opera. So it's very tech, it's very science, it's very research-based, but it's really an artistic project that is driving the ideas of it in collaboration with scientists and technologists. So, I mean, it's the kind of project that fits that, and that's a hard foundation to get into because there's you want to talk about like an application. I think it was like 500 pages, the application for that funding. It was much more in the scientific model of applying for a grant. So, yeah, I mean, I know of instances like that, but I don't know of that many that are encouraging the collaboration. And I think this is a context where we have an opportunity for greater collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that's a fabulous question. We fund a lot of artists who are working with scientists, and we are funding projects related to medical history as well. I'm thinking of two. One is Lori Sheck, who is a writer. She's investigating the use of DES. I can't pronounce the full drug name, but it was given to women in the middle part of the 20th century to improve the health of the pregnancy, and it caused a lot of disabilities and medical issues in people who basically were born with a lot of health problems. It was a drug that was administered without any controlled testing, and it's now being researched and investigated, but I think it's an example of what's happening in women's health and in medical science. That's one project. There's another project. We have an artist named Lucy Kim who's collaborating with MIT, and she is making images with E. coli bacteria, and she's growing those into melanin. And then she is investigating how human perception uses melanin to sort of categorize and make judgments about people. And so she's trained as a painter, but she's working with scientists. So there's a lot of examples like that. And our artists are also very interested in collaborative work, doing a lot of work with Stanford, UCLA, and various other places. But I'd love to talk more about that. Thank you.
I'm just going to make a plug off of Christine's point for collaboration. I think it is so important, and I think people being willing to get outside of their comfort zones and explore subjects and areas that may be unfamiliar to them. So I'm not a scientist, don't know a lot about medicine. However, I do spend time thinking about it. So, for instance, in my book, in chapter 4, I'm dealing with medical racism in relationship to Othello. And the reason I bring up medical racism, for instance, is Dr. Uche Blackstock. If people are familiar with her, she just recently published a book called Legacy, A Black Physician Reckons with Racism in Medicine. And most people wouldn't think about Shakespeare being able to be part of that conversation, but that work absolutely is. I'm not going to tell you how, because I wrote a book, so you could go get it. But I think it's really important to collaborate. And so I learned from people who, I was talking with Emily last night from Midnight Oil Collective. I learned from people who know more about subjects than I do, so that I can then have a gateway into conversations and begin to figure out how is that related to what I do. Because I think some things are more similar than people often like to acknowledge.
I'll just add one thing to that question. One of the first fellowships that we created for graduate students was with the School of Public Health here, and it was an Arts and Health Fellowship. And so that Arts and Health Fellow was particularly interested in theater and using theater as a mechanism for communicating health crises, information, and getting information out. So we were able to do two public performances, like two public works. Performances with that student. So I think that there's a lot of interest for arts and health, and yeah, we're trying to do it here too.
So I think we are out of time. I wanted to thank our panelists. So Jennifer, Kristen, Christine, and David, as well as Francis and Allison for pulling all this together. And then just quickly, Kristen, you have a big event coming up next week. I wanted to give you an opportunity to plug it. I've been on your silent auction. Looks like there's a big party coming up. So those of you who are in the New York area, this would be a good opportunity to learn more about Yale.
Yeah, it's my farewell gala. I'm leaving the organization as of Monday. So it's my 30th anniversary and the organization's 30th anniversary. And there's a dance. We still have tickets available for the dance party starting at 9:30 with DJ Pickles for $50, open bar, free food. So come. But even more important, come see Priestess of Twerk, which is Nia Witherspoon's work that we're currently producing that's playing through June 8th at the Irondale Center, which is also a Creative Capital Fund project. And it's a really special work. And it's a Black Femme Star Temple. So don't miss that.
Terrific. Thank you.